The budget process is critical in government. In fact, many of us who study the budget process believe that the budget process is the only real policy process. This is because even if a law exists, it cannot be implemented without budgetary authority. For instance, marijuana is illegal under federal law. However, the states that currently allow retail marijuana sales aren't allowed to do that because of a footnote in the budget. The money appropriated is prohibited from use to enforce the marijuana statute in states where the sales are legal at the state level. Hence, the federal law, which is very clear and puts marijuana in the same category as heroin, is immaterial because the budget controls, and the budget is the policy document of government. This is my opinion. Don't take it to the bank or whatever, but it is the actual reality of government. In the previous slide, the budget is, in my view, the only policy document or only real policy document in government. Budget decisions do shape all the government programs. They determine what programs will exist, and they are the meat, if you will, of government. It is these things that are translating various normative values, in other words, different special interest groups, interests, into a policy document, which is the budget, which is arrived at by compromise. It is very important to remember that the reason the budget does not attain some perfection, whatever that might be, is because you need to get one more than 50% of the votes plus the president's signature in order to pass the budget. This means that you must compromise across the board. For an insight into the compromise, take out your tax form. Look at the 1040 form, and all of the lines that you do not fill in are provisions that were put there by special interests which don't represent your particular needs, desires, or goals. The role of government and its budget in the economy is debatable. With all due respect to Don Kettl, who I happen to know, he is not a student of the budget and finance, as I have been for, well, almost 40 years. The federal budget does have an influence on the economy. However, that influence is not always well understood. In other words, we don't necessarily know what the impact will be of a particular budgetary policy or overall fiscal policy. So changes in spending and taxation, such as happened recently, the implications and impacts, short-term, mid-term, and long-term, are not well understood. Therefore, it is difficult, if not impossible, to predict those things. Herbert Simon, who has been quoted in this text before, actually said that the reason is these problems become computationally intractable. He said that in 1948, which is the year I was born. And he then later, just before his death, after working at Carnegie Mellon University with all these computer people, said, well, now computers have solved that problem and we can fix everything. The difficulty is not so much that the problem is computationally intractable. The problem is it revolves around human reactions to given stimuli, and we can't predict those. The idea of John Maynard Keynes, who's the father of this pump priming and that sort of thing, that was embodied to some degree in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, but more completely in World War II, mobilization and government spending, along with taking 500,000 men out of the workforce, because you don't actually guide the economy in ways that are clearly understood. The difficulty arises in predicting the aggregate behavior of large groups of people to a given stimulus in a dynamic environment. We can argue all day about what the average American, whoever that might be, will do if given an extra $1,000 a month or $1,000 a year. But until we try it under certain conditions, we don't know what will actually happen. And in the longer term, we don't necessarily know that all those conditions will repeat themselves, and therefore we don't know if we'll get the same outcome the next time we try the same experiment. Fiscal year is the budget year. It currently starts for the federal government in October 1 and runs through September 30. A surplus is more revenues than expenditures for a given budget year. That doesn't happen very often, and it is thought, in the Keynesian sense, to slow the economy by taking more money out of the economy than is necessary to run the government. This is sometimes called a deadweight loss. In other words, if I charge you $100 for something that I only need $75 for, I have taken $25 in spendable income from you. I have taken it out of your discretion and put it into government's discretion with respect to what to do with that. The deficit is the annual shortfall when revenues are exceeded by expenditures, which is the typical situation in the federal government. The last time the federal budget was in surplus or balanced is at least 20 years ago, to the best of my recollection. The idea that this new money, called quantitative easing during the last go-round, pumps money into the economy is true. There are more dollars floating around. Right? However, its impact on economic growth, while our author seems to think it's very well understood, is in fact not well understood. The impact is dependent upon the reaction of the public, in other words, you and I and all the other people you know, in the aggregate. I might save all the money, you might spend it all. It's in the aggregate. It is not in the individual. And the idea that it necessarily promotes economic growth begs the question of what is economic growth? Is it more jobs? Is it better jobs? Et cetera, et cetera. And how do we measure that? GDP is one measure. Many people criticize it. There are some fairly serious questions about whether or not it promotes economic growth, as our author seems to state flatly, but that is not the case in my view. Brings us to the debt, and we hear about the national debt all the time, and that is, in fact, our author does get this right, it is the accumulated deficits over time. In other words, in a year when the budget is in deficit, Treasury will sell Treasury securities, bonds and notes on various terms. Some of them are short term, some of them are 30 years, but to fund, create money, in essence, for that purpose, so that those expenditures can be made. I just want to break in and point out that while the debt is important, it is only about 1/2 of long-term liabilities. Long-term liabilities, while they include debt, also include all of the promises made under Social Security, Federal Retirement System, VA, et cetera, to future payments, commitments. So they are, under current law, also part of the long-term liabilities. The last time I calculated long-term liabilities, there was almost double debt. It was almost exactly double the debt, and that's back when the debt was a mere $12 trillion. Monetary policy does, in fact, refer to the Federal Reserve's management of the money supply. However, in today's market, global market, post-Bretton Woods agreement, right, money is created by lots and lots of other sources that used to not influence the money supply. You can create money when you go out and use a credit card. You have no dollars, you have borrowed money, you have created part of the money supply. Long-term borrowing, etc., mortgages, etc., also create portions of the money supply. As we have moved into the late 20th and early 21st century, and this has become more common, the Federal Reserve's portion of the money supply that they control has become smaller as a function of the overall money supply. The other issue is globalization. Other entities create money that the Federal Reserve has little or no control over. I am afraid that I must, to some degree, respectfully disagree with our author in this particular regard. The national economy, to some extent, might influence the federal budget. However, there are so many more factors, normative factors, that go into the federal budget formulation that it's difficult for me to go along with the idea that it actually shapes it to any significant degree. The budget does have components of it that appear to be quantitative. So CBO will do budget scoring. They'll say, what are the long-term effects of this? You've got the Government Accountability Office coming along behind and doing audits, and you have other agencies like OMB that actually do these kinds of things. BEA looks at unemployment, but BEA calculates 6 different unemployment rates. The one you hear about is the most common, but there are others which are used for different purposes. Inflation and interest rates are all to some extent influenced by this, but they are not dispositive. Certainly there is an impact, but the idea that the economic forecast somehow drives the budget, which our author seems to imply, is in my view and experience incorrect. I had significant input and dealt directly with OMB, which is technically the White House, and congressional committees for the United States Department of Commerce when I was in the senior executive service at Commerce. And later, I dealt with the OECD budget while I was posted in Paris. I find it difficult to do anything but agree heartily with the author's characterization that the budget at the federal, state, and local level is fundamentally about and driven by political choices. And, importantly, political choices are driven by compromise. If you have 5 people on a board, and I started on a utility board that had 5 people, I was the chair, but I needed at least 2 other votes to get anything into the budget. I made compromises, sometimes voted for things I didn't like very much, and spent money on things that I didn't believe in because I needed to get the cooperation of at least 2 of the other members. When you expand that out to something the size of the Congress, 2 different houses, all manner of special interests, then you can see that the problem becomes immensely complex in terms of resolving the controversies that may come up. Here, OMB comes out with what they call a guidance that they give to all the departments to tell them how their budget should be prepared, what the parameters are, what the increases are, etc. However, the difficulty is that all the departments immediately ignore that because you have a division in every single government department that is called legislative affairs. And those people are internal lobbyists. They have close relationships with committees of jurisdiction and appropriation committees, if they're any good at all. to make sure that their budgets are defended. And they're very good at this. So the executive budget, and that sort of thing, is a guidance, and it's interesting, and it's a big exercise, and they spend a lot of time doing it. But the fact of the matter is, the budget that comes out the other end is the congressional budget, as it always has been. The establishment of spending targets and those sort of things by OMB certainly does constrain the budget request that is submitted to OMB, consolidated, and becomes that part of the president's budget. But it has little or nothing to do with the actual budget request that is really being made to Congress. The idea of bottom-up budget making, incrementalism, etc., is probably closer to my experience than the top-down system described previously. Actually, the way the budget happens is you get what's called a base budget. So let's say the base budget for your 2019 fiscal year, 2020 fiscal year, is set, but it is not, the 2020 base budget is not the budget that you had in 2019. It is that plus an inflation factor. So when you hear the budget has been cut 3% or whatever, understand that that doesn't mean it's even gone back to the prior level. All it means is that from the inflated base, it has been cut some percentage. Right? Budget increase percentages are typically 5 to 7%. So if they say, well, we're going to give, in a budget guidance, you get a 7% base. Your 2019 budget is 20%, is 7% more, is your 2020 budget base. Now we're going to cut 2% from that, so you're still 5% above, and that's just in the base budget. The incrementalism, the asking for what's Wildowski calls a fair share over the increase base, over the agency's base. Remember, the agency base is this inflated number, and what people are struggling to do is to get a piece of whatever money happens to be laying around. And not only is that true within the departments, but the committees also do that, because as a member of Congress, your power is directly involved with how much money you get to dispose of. So it's not just the budget people and the executive that are struggling over this. The committees struggle within Congress over this, and then of course you have the so-called special interests who come in and chime in too. This is where the horse trading starts to go on. The reasons my experience tends to make me favor the bottom-up theory, if I accept any of them in whole, is that in fact nobody does consider the entire budget. That's part of the problem. What happens is the budget is delivered to Congress finally when it's all passed through the various procedures. Both houses have had a conference committee, and the conference committee is a lot like an auction where people run around in a room and try to get the two bills, the one passed by the Senate and one passed by the House, into one form. And then the entire budget, which can be 1,000 pages long, you have two copies. They have like 2 hours to consider it. Nobody's going to read that much in that amount of time. Right? And so what happens is I come to you. I know you're on a committee of, I don't know, economic development, and I'm on a committee for housing, and I come to you and I say, you know, I think my section's pretty good. I'm going to vote for it. I hope you will too. And I think you can probably tell me the same thing about your section, and we'll get this all done. Political battles do focus on the size of agency increments. However, they also focus on the overall perspective with respect to all the interest groups and their relative leverage. And remember, relative leverage changes over time. I'm not going to speak very much about the reform attempts because actually, in my view, they are merely attempts to put a rational framework on what is essentially an irrational process. This is not some mechanical process where we grind in the facts on this end and out comes the reasonable budget on the other end. It is not a rational or reasonable process. It is an emotional process. It is a political process. And the budget reforms are an attempt to reform the procedures and not the actual process itself. My experience, the actual process doesn't change much. The Program Assessment Rating Tool, or PART, is, pardon my New England accent, so comes through every once in a while, is something that certainly they tried to measure performance, etc., but the difficulty is everybody thinks their program is great. Everybody thinks their program is doing well. And so when you try to do performance assessment, you wind up in a situation of people trying to game the system. And there's a great deal of energy spent on that. And so, as GAO once reported, you have 60 different programs, all of which are supposed to be doing economic development. Rationally, you'd want to have those all in one program. Right? But the fact of the matter is you can't disengage them from all of the different committees and departments that they're engaged by. The other problem with the Program Assessment Rating Tool is that it attempts to measure outcomes. However, I can tell you from my own experience that if, for instance, you have an economic development initiative, and I remember one for a Honda plant in Georgia, all of the agencies, regardless of how much they contributed to the project, and there are 4 federal agencies and 2 state funds in that particular project, took full credit for all of the jobs, private investment, etc., that got, quote, created. Well, that's at least quadruple counting of the benefits. So the Program Assessment Rating Tool and the performance assessment reports are problematic, let's say. I think our author makes a mistake when he characterizes uncontrollable expenditures. What he's really talking about is entitlements, and describing them as uncontrollable is not technically true because Congress could change the law. Congress could and has changed the law with respect to Social Security. You have to be older than my parents did when they retire. I now get taxed on 85% of my Social Security benefits because I have other income. That didn't used to be the case. They are not uncontrollable. They are entitlement expenditures, which are difficult to control because you have to change the law in order to do it. The other portion of what I would call the, other than the entitlements, I would call the discretionary budget. And in fact, it is the discretionary budget that is so small at this point. Those are the things that year after year, Congress actually has to reapprove, as opposed to things like entitlements, which are ongoing commitments until, or unless, the law is changed that creates them. For that reason, I disagree with our author's characterization that they're uncontrollable. Again, the characterization in this section is a little inconsistent with my personal experience. Congress does authorize expenditures and revenues, right? But it is not Congress writ large that's doing this. There are individual committees that make these decisions, and very, 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 very rarely do the committee's determinations get overturned in some revolutionary form on the floor of the Congress, of either house generally. So actually what happens is individual committees, pretty much without knowledge of anyone else, go around and generate these expenditures. They both authorize, which means they create the, well, we'll get to that in a minute, I guess, authorize and appropriate. And it is those committees and all the interactions that goes on around them, not the General Congress, that does this. The big problem, or one of the big problems, is nobody really has a comprehensive view of either the taxing or the spending that's going on. The reactions of the Congress to the proposals is only one factor in budget appropriations. The committees themselves have internal rivalries. I want my committee to have as much authority vis-a-vis your committee as we did last year, and maybe more, if I can get it. The other thing is that there are large groups of special interests, and please don't think these are all the guys with the black hats like in the old cowboy movies. Special interests include seniors. I'm a member of that one. Federal retirees. I'm a member of that one. Veterans. I'm a member of that one. And et cetera and so forth. The retarded children. Special education. It goes on and on and on. Homeowners are a special interest. Everybody is a member of at least a few special interests. So when special interests are characterized negatively or tendentiously, don't get yourself too bought into that, because really the issue is how the entire process goes forward and how the various interests get accommodated. How Congress react to them, and then some of these ploys, the Washington Monument ploy, dire consequences. If you cut the budget of my program, the world will come to an end kind of predictions, those kinds of things are all very much in the mix. So yeah, it's generally speaking very difficult for the Congress or even the executive, as the OMB, to reach inside the departments and decide exactly what should be cut, which is why some of these ploys work. When you're a member of Congress, you don't want to be a member of an authorization committee. They are much weaker than the appropriations committees. Appropriations committees get to spend money, which means they have a great deal more influence. They get a great deal more influence with the lobbyists and with everyone else because they get to actually spend money. Congress regularly forgets to reauthorize programs. However, in most cases, if the money is appropriated, even though the program technically doesn't exist because it has not been reauthorized, the money will be spent by the department that receives it because the General Counsel will interpret that as congressional approval. So the distinction between the authorization and appropriation process is really not quite as forceful or as clear-cut as our author or any of the theories of how Congress works would like to suggest. Well, this is simply nonsense. The original budget for the U.S. government started on January 1 and went to a calendar year. It got pushed to April, then to July, and in 1974 to October, each time to give Congress more time to work on the budget. However, if you stop to think about this for about a second, it doesn't give the Congress any more time at all, except in 1974 when they got a couple extra months. Because each of the years runs right after another, because the budget's an annual process. So the idea that actually got more time to work on it is nonsense. That's been the excuse every time that they've done it, and it's gone almost all the way around the calendar yet. Of the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, this Legislative Budget Office, which actually scores, as they say, bills to figure out how much they're going to cost and what the expenditure is going to be, etc., is something that is relatively new, but it was supposed to balance the power of OMB. In other words, give Congress some of their own experts to fire back at OMB during disputes with the administration. Here's an interesting factoid. The so-called dark web, underground web, where all this drug dealing and all this stuff goes on the internet, is funded, was funded, about 70% of it was funded by the Navy's budget, although it was stuck in the black budget someplace in the Navy line items and funneled off to God knows who. These kinds of things, it's not just DOD, it's NSA, it's FBI has some undercover stuff. There's all kinds of things going on in these so-called black budgets. Earmarks officially have gone away. In other words, Congress no longer issues language in the budget that says we want $10 million spent on Project A in my jurisdiction. What they do then is they recommend budget notes or in testimony. So Senator Snort will recommend that the Department of Commerce support a grant application from XYZ city in the amount of $10,407,000.47. So one of the things Legislative Affairs does after the budget thing is they go through, comb through, and look for all of this stuff in the testimony and the comments, et cetera, so you know where the pork barrel spending is supposed to go. Otherwise, you'll be crosswise with important people, and you don't want to deal with that. The continuing resolution is exactly what it sounds like. It basically says we will go another X weeks, X months based on last year's budget. And OMB is releasing this stuff in quarterly increments anyway, so it's not like people are going hog wild. It's when Congress fails to either pass a budget and doesn't decide they're going to do a shutdown. If a continuing resolution is not adopted, then you get a shutdown. Budget process reforms suggested on this slide in our text focus entirely on the federal budget. Right? The idea of creating a biennial budget, because then Congress would, have more time to conduct oversight. The last thing they need is more time, because then you'd have a biennial budget and no more oversight than you have now, in my opinion. A capital budget. One of the major distinctions between all other budgets, state and local, nonprofit, private sector budgets, and the federal budget, is there is no capital budget in the federal system. So highways and operations are funded out of the same budget. The difficulty is that there is no appreciation of long-term benefits, and so you have no distinction in the budget between a highway or a bridge that might last for 20 years and a one-time grant that might last for 1 year. It's very, very confusing, and it does not effectively allow you to do what's called capital improvement planning, which we'll get into more next semester. The idea of giving the president a line item veto, last raised by Ronald Reagan, to the best of my knowledge, is going nowhere. Congress is simply not going to give up that kind of authority. They pass a budget, and they want the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel accepted or rejected. It also gives Congress a lot more leverage, because let's say the president has 2 or 3 line items that he or she doesn't like. Well, in a 1,000-page budget, that's pretty small potatoes. So the Congress has a lot of leverage. So you don't pass the whole thing? Sorry, Buster. So there's a lot of balance and trading going on, and Congress would lose a lot of leverage if there were a line item veto. The idea that a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution be passed is specious beyond belief. In the first place, there's no common definition of what a balanced budget is, as we'll learn next semester. And even if it were passed, Congress would find a way around it. I mean, these people have an amazing ability to mean one thing and say another, and God knows what all else. So even if that were to happen, which it's not going to, it would be meaningless in my view. Budget execution is a dance, if you will, between the members of Congress on committees of jurisdiction and in whose districts various things are supposed to be happening, whether they're programmatic or capital, and grant issuance, contract issuance, etc. And the executive is supposed to be overseeing all this. OMB technically oversees all this. I can tell you from my own experience that you wind up at the federal grants officers level, and even there, they have very little control over what actually goes on. The reason for this is that there are so many special conditions. For instance, I had, I forget how many, maybe 24 grants that went to universities. Unless I could prove fraud, I could not have auditors go in and look at their books. But of course, you can't really prove fraud until you've had the auditors audit their books. So it's completely circular, and the money goes into university grants and disappears. You have no way of figuring out what happened with it. And even the fact that I could demonstrate that part of the grant was supposed to be for items that changed with the activity levels, I could not say, if they get a grant for $2,004,047 and they spend it down to every penny, how can that possibly be true when those costs that rise and fall with different operational levels change? Cannot be true, but that was insufficient evidence. The Impoundment Control Act is just, they tried to stop the president from refusing to spend money that had been appropriated for things that he or she didn't approve of. Much to say about this particular topic. Budget execution is very complex. Deferrals, rescissions are really not so much of an issue as you may think. Much more, it involves how you actually spend the money out and where you spend it. Most of this management control idea is theoretical, and most of these theories come from people like Dr. Kettl, who has no practical experience in government. I can tell you that your control as a federal grants officer, which I was, and contracting officer's technical representative, which I also did, your control over the flow of the money is very, very, very limited. The money trail does not really demonstrate who's doing what, because much of it goes into these black holes. Right? Here's a research budget for this university, or trade adjustment assistance program, or something else like that, and the money goes in and is gone. And then they send you back whatever they think sounds good in terms of results and outcomes. Of course, they all conspire or collude or coordinate to make sure they all look good. I mean, they actually have conference calls. I found out about one, chimed in on it. But anyway, so controlling the flow of money does control how quickly things happen, but because of the implicit rule that if you have a surplus at the end of the year, you'll lose money the next year, what happens, and you can see this in every single budget and government that I have looked at and had any experience with, is in the last couple of months, expenditures go up. Because what's happened is people have controlled the flow of money, if you will, right, making sure they don't run out. And then at the end, they go, holy smoke, I got this extra money, I got to get rid of it. And so the number of grants, the number of contracts, the number of commitments, etc., that are made in those last couple of months, phenomenal. I made friends with the CIO and got printers and plotters, and I mean, it's big scale plotter, and all sorts of goodies for my staff, because I would go to Doris and say, well, you know, it's August. How much money you got, honey? And because we were friends, she'd give me anything I wanted. It was pretty cool. But of course, it's not my money. And then the flow of money is important in evaluating the agency performance. Agency performance is a very, very, very difficult thing to measure. For instance, I was consulting, I'm pretty well known for performance evaluation in the federal government. I was consulting with the FBI at one point, and the question comes up, so how do we measure crimes that didn't happen. In other words, how do we measure the effectiveness of our prevention activities? Well, I mean, how do you measure things that didn't happen? How do you determine whether an economic development program is successful? One of the things that I fought was this Economic Development Administration that was in the Department of Commerce was giving grants to people for economic development, and many of them revolved around some sort of public works. So the Congress would come back next year and say, so what'd you do with the money? Because that was their budget cycle. Well, nothing happened. The public works weren't even started. And it took me about 5 years. And so now if you look at the Economic Development Administration, you will see that they report 3, 6, and 9 years after the money was appropriated on what happens. Because evaluating agency performance is a function of the timelines, among other things. State and local government budgeting is similar but different. The strategies and many other things are consistent. However, the tax structure is fundamentally different. And the states and local governments have, many of them have balanced budget amendments. Again, next term, we'll get into what that actually means, different for different states. All right? But they can and do engage in long-term borrowing, contrary to what our author believes. In fact, many long-term liabilities, notably state pension fund liabilities, are being funded either substantially or exclusively by issuing debt. Debt of state and local governments is generically known as municipal bonds, and the state of Kentucky just sold a bunch after their latest catastrophe, but I can think of instances back to New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman before she joined the Bush 1 administration. She sold municipal bonds to make the payments for the state pension fund for the 2 years, or biennial budget in New Jersey, for the 2 years that she was responsible for just before she left, and thereby she balanced the budget. Well, that's nonsense, but in any case. And then the other thing is that states will usually have a capital budget, and the advantage of capital budget is something we'll go into more deeply next term. But basically, the capital budget is extremely important in determining how capital improvements will be made, or it can be. Operational budgets, just like anything else, the government doesn't pay salaries, people don't go to work. While I agree with the author's general conclusions that the budget is the only policy document, although he doesn't quite say it that way, the budget process is the policy process. And it is subject to some evolution as the process goes forward. So you see executive budgets, they change into legislative budgets, they change into appropriations, and the implementation of those budgets is something that goes on. It's an ongoing process, and they can change slightly or significantly depending upon the politics and other problems that come up as you implement the budget. In reformulating the budget, you need to understand that money that is appropriated by the legislative authority for one purpose cannot willy-nilly be shifted to some other purpose. In other words, if I get so many dollars for personnel, because I saved money in personnel, I can't stick it over in capital budget. I can't move it over to build something or buy typewriters or anything else. The legislative authority, at least in theory, has the final say. So if, for instance, you're at the congressional level, you have to go to the committee and get their approval to what's called reprogram the money. I read a paper recently where the person said, well, we saved money in this part, why couldn't we put it into employee retention? Well, that's the reason. You can't reprogram money willy-nilly. It is the legislative authority that gets to do that. Now, you have some latitude as to what's what, and what money is spent on and how you interpret things. But the fact of the matter is, you can't just move things around.